Now this is important information. Recently, the US government has become an investor in the stock market. Authorities call this a new economic strategy, .PUT. The essence is as follows. Over the past few months, the United States has acquired ownership stakes in several strategically important corporations. Today, the government owns about 10 of Intel, the leading microchip manufacturer, and 15 of MP Materials, the only company in the US that mines rare earth metals. In addition, it holds around 10 of the shares of the Canadian company Lithium Americas, which controls one of the largest lithium deposits in North America. And let's add to this list what Donald Trump calls a golden share in the steel company US Steel, which was purchased in the summer of 2025 by the Japanese company Nippon Steel. This golden share gives the government veto power over decisions made within the company. As a result, all these corporations, which were once private, now partially belong to the US government, and in some cases are even directly controlled by it. The official explanation for these measures is related to national security concerns. Authorities want to ensure that the country can produce its own semiconductors, extract rare earth metals, and manufacture steel without relying on China or anyone else. However, the real significance of what is happening is far greater, because all of this will lead to major changes in how the American economy functions. The key point is that the state is becoming a co-owner of businesses. Its influence goes beyond simple regulatory oversight. At the same time, it begins to influence profits, management decisions, and changes the rules of competition. Essentially, this allows the government to designate winners and losers in the market. As a result, the boundary between free markets and state control becomes blurred. But the most paradoxical part of this situation is that the United States is now adopting the very model it warned the world against for decades. This is the approach used by China, where the government, through ownership stakes in strategic enterprises, uses them as a lever to manage the economy. For years, Washington argued that such a system is unfair, based on manipulation and dangerous for global competition. Now the US itself intends to move in the same direction. Naturally, many questions arise. For example, how exactly does the government purchase stakes in these companies? Where does the money come from? Is this good or bad? And how will this affect investors and their portfolios? The situation is developing rapidly and is generating significant interest. So let's take a closer look at everything. The first and key question is, how does the US technically acquire these shares? Where does it get the funds for this? Let's look at the example of Intel, the world's largest microprocessor manufacturer. In this case, the government converted funding allocated under the CHIPS and Science Act into equity capital. Instead of issuing grants for building new factories, the Treasury Department and the Department of Commerce negotiated the direct acquisition of shares. This amounted to approximately 9.9, with an option to increase the stake if Intel meets production targets and job creation goals. As for an MP Materials, the Department of Defense used so-called convertible, preferred shares, and special contracts. All of this guarantees the government access to rare earth metals in exchange for financing. As a result of the deal, the US obtained approximately 15 of the company's shares, as well as the ability to influence its operational activities, pricing policy, and exports. Regarding Lithium Americas, the Department of Energy revised the terms of a massive $2.30 billion, originally intended to develop a lithium deposit in Nevada. However, instead of non-repayable financing, the government added a clause to the agreement providing guarantees in the form of shares. This gave it the right to acquire up to 10 of the company's stock if the project proved successful. Another example is Trilogy Metals. This mining exploration and development company received extremely large-scale funding from the federal government. The funding was allocated for the construction of a new access road in Alaska, which the company needed. In return, the government received around 10 of the company's shares and long-term rights to the extracted resources. As for us steel, an interesting situation unfolded. When the Japanese company Nippon Steel announced its intention to acquire it, the White House immediately put forward conditions. The deal would only be possible if the United States received a golden share. This special non-financial stake grants the US government veto power over key corporate decisions, such as plant closures, export sales, or executive appointments. In other words, anything that could threaten national security interests. Thus, instead of passing new laws or directly nationalizing industries, the government is using a wide range of tools: credit programs, the Chips and Science Act, the Defense Production Act, Pentagon-backed loan guarantees for energy projects, and regulatory approvals, all designed to secure ownership stakes in private companies. In practice, a key condition of these deals becomes simple. If you want our approval, you must give us a piece of your business. Now that the US government is acting as an investor, a natural question arises: is this level of support justified? There's no simple answer. Whether it's good or bad depends on perspective. On one hand, it looks like a carefully calculated strategic move aimed at protecting America's future. The country wants to keep critical industries under national control: semiconductor manufacturing, energy, and metallurgy. This is especially important in a world where China controls up to 90% of rare earth mining, around 70% of lithium production, and manufactures more solar panels than the rest of the world combined. This raises the next question: how can you compete with an opponent that wields such massive influence through total control of its supply chains? China manages both resources and production capacity, making it nearly impossible for the US to compete on equal terms. Let's look at a clear example. If you take a closer look at Chinese electric vehicles, you'll find that China is already producing cars with ranges exceeding 640 kilometers, 400 miles on a single charge. Some models rival hypercars in performance and offer levels of luxury that even premium Western manufacturers struggle to match. And yet, their average price is only $30,000, $40,000. It's obvious that if these vehicles enter the US market, no domestic manufacturer, including Tesla, could compete. Consumers would overwhelmingly choose Chinese cars. The reason isn't a lack of American technology. Not at all. The real issue is cost. If such vehicles were produced in the United States, they would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. That makes them inaccessible. China can achieve this partly because it appropriates intellectual property from US research and development, and partly due to extreme production localization. But the most important factor is this: China can eliminate R&D costs entirely and subsidize production directly through the state. No free market model can compete with that approach. For many years, the United States observed this process without being able to respond with equal competition, because true competition under these conditions is fundamentally impossible. Now the paradigm is beginning to shift. The US is coming to terms with the reality that free market ideology cannot defeat a planned economy that uses the full power of the state to gain dominance. America's response is to start playing by the same rules, elevating national security to the level of an absolute priority. From a political standpoint, this is extremely important. No president wants to be responsible for losing the race in technology and energy to another country. All these deals involving shares of private companies allow the current Trump administration to say, "We are bringing jobs back, we are building factories, we are investing in America again." On paper, this looks extremely patriotic and rational. However, such actions imply serious changes in the very nature of capitalism. When a country's government starts deciding which companies deserve to exist, who should receive approval and funding and who should not, this is no longer a truly free market. And at this point, the situation begins to increasingly resemble the Chinese model. But then a logical question arises: what exactly is wrong with this? Let's look at the situation this way when the state becomes a market investor. It changes the rules of competition. Historical experience and factual data confirm this. According to the theory of the fourth turning, approximately every 80 years, a fourth and final phase of the cycle occurs the decline of an empire. This phase is characterized by active government intervention in order to establish control over industries that the authorities consider necessary for their own survival. If in the 1940s these were steel, oil, and weapons, today they are semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and energy. Government financial support of companies creates distorted incentives. Corporations may begin making deals not to create a better product, but to lobby politicians' interests, buying favorable financing and approvals for themselves. Of course, government subsidies are far more attractive than risky investments in their own research and development. We have already seen how this happens in other economies dominated by state capital. Innovation and creativity slow down there because the safest strategy becomes political maneuvering rather than creating a better product. Why actually take risks trying to outperform Apple in making a better smartphone if you can simply invest resources into strengthening ties with an official who can secure government support? You are watching this video because you are looking for answers. Every day, events happen in the world that require immediate commentary, and our team does not wait. We provide our analysis as quickly as possible on our Telegram channel. And dialogue with you is extremely important to us. It is on Telegram that we collect your questions, discuss content, and share commentary from our experts. Your opinions, your feedback, and even your doubts, all of this helps us make our content better and more precise. We value everyone who watches and analyzes together with us. If you need timely analysis and want to become part of his live community, we are waiting for you. Subscribe to our new Telegram channel. For insiders, only the link is in the description. All actions of the US government right now suggest that this practice will now occur more often. But here one serious risk appears. Capital may begin flowing away from successful and promising companies toward those that manage to secure government favor. Over time, this will weaken the entire economy. We have already seen a similar scenario in China, where the state owns controlling stakes in so-called strategic sectors, finance, energy, technology, and industry. But instead of a competitive market and a free economy, a system emerged that economists themselves call rent-seeking behavior. This is when companies work not for customers, but to preserve the favor of authorities. As a result, a distorted system emerges. On one hand, companies with political connections gain access to favorable loans, tax benefits, and subsidies. On the other hand, independent companies, even the most innovative ones, face a shortage of financing and administrative barriers. Over time, such companies simply can no longer withstand competition. Privileges for some led to reduced creativity, wasted money, slower growth, and lower entrepreneurial risk. That is why some analysts argue that China's main weakness is not demographics or debt, but dependence on government patronage. If the United States follows the same path, it risks creating an economy where political connections are valued higher than innovation and creativity. Similar processes, although with their own specifics, have been observed for decades in Russia, where the state, through state corporations and direct share ownership, maintains dominant influence over key sectors of the economy: energy, the military-industrial complex, and natural resource extraction. This model is often described as state capitalism. It provides the Kremlin with direct control over strategic assets and allows it to use economic leverage to achieve political goals. For example, the energy company Gazprom, a monopoly on pipeline gas exports, is more than 50% owned by the state. Gazprom serves two functions. It replenishes the state budget and acts as a powerful lever of influence on the international stage. An enormous role is also played by the military-industrial complex, overseen by the state corporation Rostec. It объединяет more than 800 scientific and manufacturing organizations, across 60 regions of the country. Rostec controls between 70 and 90 of total production in sectors such as aircraft manufacturing, mechanical engineering, radio electronics, weapons, and special equipment. Finally, the state also holds another key piece of infrastructure in its hands, the country's largest bank. Sberbank is controlled by the state through the central bank, which owns 50+1 share, ensuring decisive voting power. Special attention should be paid to the phenomenon of the nationalization of elites, a process in which large private companies in Russia gradually fall under direct or indirect state control. One example that comes to mind is the fate of Otkrity Bank, which experienced a massive financial crisis in 2017. Instead of allowing it to go bankrupt, the state, through the central bank, became its main owner. A similar fate befell other private banks, such as BN Bank and Promsvyaz Bank, which came under the control of state structures. But one of the most striking examples was the seizure of the car dealer Rolf from its founder Sergei Petrov in 2023. The same mechanism used to nationalize foreign assets was applied to Rolf. By presidential decree, the company was transferred into temporary state management. And this has been done many times. After the start of the special military operation in Ukraine, the assets of foreign energy companies Fortum and Uniper came under the control of Rosneft. The family of Ramzan Kadyrov received the Russian business of Danone, and the former head of Baltika, Teimuraz Baloev, returned to lead the company after it was taken away from Carlsberg. In 2024, Danone and Carlsberg regained control of their enterprises, only to later transfer them to new owners at large discounts. All of this now brings us to the main question. Why is the US government beginning to buy stakes on the stock market precisely now? The answer lies in the global struggle for control over the future. This struggle is unfolding against the backdrop of a slowing Chinese economy, Russia's isolation from the West, and record levels of debt in the United States itself. At the same time, the world is splitting into two economic systems. One is based on the dollar, and the other on Chinese capital. Both camps have entered a fierce competition for access to key resources: energy, microchips, minerals, and the internet. Whoever dominates these areas determines the future world order. In short, China is currently winning. Let's take rare earth metals as an example. China controls not only their extraction, but the entire chain from purification and processing to export quotas and licensing. This gives Beijing a powerful lever of influence. It is enough to press the right button and supplies can be stocked. In this way, China dictates prices and can use its resources as a weapon. And this applies not only to minerals. China accounts for about 80% of global solar panel production. Under these conditions, traditional tools such as trade deals or sanctions prove ineffective against a country that fully controls its production supply chains. This is why the United States has become so active. They simply cannot compete with China in an open market. America cannot use the dollar as a weapon against China the way it does against smaller economies. At the same time, a classic reset in the form of war would not work either. It is not a winning option. The US government understands this. So what is the United States supposed to do? One can assume that its current strategy follows the principle: if you can't beat your opponent, adopt their methods. This is precisely what explains the purchase of shares on the stock market. It is a forced measure. The US is building its own version of state capitalism, whether anyone likes it or not. How favorable is such a situation for the average American who lives and invests in the United States? The answer is, no one can predict the consequences. Many already say that there is nothing new in all of this, that the United States is simply catching up, and in one sense, they are right. This is not the first instance of state intervention. The US Department of Defense's research agency stood at the origins of the Internet, and NASA financed space technologies. The list goes on. However, the situation now is fundamentally different. The government is no longer just providing funding, it is becoming a co-owner of businesses. And this very fact of ownership radically changes the incentive structure. This creates serious risks, because the mixing of politics with free markets blurs the boundaries between them, making it nearly impossible to determine where one ends and the other begins. At first glance, this strategy undoubtedly looks attractive and patriotic for America. It appears to be investing in its future. But the reality is that this is not the type of production that will bring millions of jobs back to the country. The industries in question, semiconductor manufacturing, lithium processing, and artificial intelligence development, are high-tech sectors that require exclusively highly qualified specialists. Often, these jobs require EFDs and robotics engineers. And these enterprises will largely consist of automated systems where machines perform most of the work, not people. As a result, even large-scale construction of new factories will not lead to a significant increase in employment in America. Yes, several thousand new jobs may appear, but these isolated successes will never compensate for the massive losses caused by total automation and the implementation of artificial intelligence. Nevertheless, for investors, this new reality opens up certain opportunities. When the government becomes an active market participant, the political component begins to play a more important role. As a result, the market leaders are not necessarily the most innovative companies, but those that demonstrate the strongest strategic and political alignment. All of this has happened before during Trump's first presidency. Many corporations actively sought favor with the administration back then, and for good reason. Today, the United States has become a kind of big boss that aggressively accumulates shares of large private companies. That is precisely why the financial industry simply cannot ignore this. Capital will follow the political course. Moreover, when the government becomes a shareholder, it is interested in keeping stock prices stable, especially ahead of elections. This acts as a kind of safety system. Essentially, the American market is now structured to avoid a collapse. And artificial intelligence plays a crucial role here, tying all these elements together. The very same technology that threatens to replace human labor will now also determine the investment strategies of the population. For investors, this could become either the greatest market surge in recent years or a complete failure.